The morning sun shone brightly over the sprawling Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, casting long shadows on the bustling crowd. Among the throngs of travelers, Jamal Lewis moved with quiet confidence, his steps steady as he approached the check-in counter. Dressed casually in a well-fitted black hoodie, dark jeans and pristine sneakers, he blended in with the crowd. There was nothing extraordinary about his appearance except for the ambition that burned behind his calm demeanor. Today was significant. Today, he was flying to New York for a business meeting that could shape the future of his career. Jamal didn't flaunt the fact that he was the son of Gregory Lewis, a renowned black businessman who had built Unity Airways from the ground up. The Lewis name held power, and Gregory was a self-made success story in a world that hadn't always been kind to men who looked like him. But Jamal wanted to make his own way, to succeed on his own terms, away from his father's influence. It wasn't just about proving himself to others, it was about proving something to himself. As he navigated through the airport, Jamal felt a sense of pride in how far he had come. At 32, he had established a respectable career in marketing, known for his innovative ideas and strategic thinking. But this meeting in New York was different. It was bigger than anything he'd done before. This deal could open doors to the next level, and Jamal wanted to walk through those doors with his own merit, not his father's reputation. After checking in, Jamal slipped through security without issue, his first-class ticket tucked neatly in his jacket pocket. He could afford it, of course. He could afford far more than that, but Jamal had always been modest in his presentation. Money didn't define him. He smiled politely at the gate agents as he handed them his boarding pass, the thought of the upcoming meeting keeping his nerves at bay. As he stepped through the jet bridge and into the plane, the familiar hum of the engines greeted him. First-class seats awaited him just a few feet away, plush and inviting. Yet for Jamal, the real challenge lay ahead, not just in New York, but in the day-to-day moments when people saw only what they wanted to see, not who he truly was. Jamal was barely a step into the aircraft when he felt the sharp gaze of Sarah Mitchell, a white flight attendant who stood at the door, her arms crossed in a gesture that was more cold than welcoming. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, and her uniform was immaculate, but her smile never reached her eyes. "Your seat is in the back," she said flatly, not even glancing at the boarding pass he held in his hand. There was no warmth in her voice, no attempt at pleasantries. Jamal blinked, momentarily stunned by her rudeness. He hadn't even said a word, and yet there it was, the assumption. The unspoken belief that a man like him, dressed casually, and with skin a shade too dark for her liking, couldn't possibly belong in first class. But he was no stranger to this kind of treatment. He had faced it before in restaurants, in stores, in meetings where his ideas were questioned until someone else, usually white, said the same thing. Still, Jamal wasn't one to lose his composure easily. He had learned, growing up as Gregory Lewis's son, that grace under pressure was a skill worth mastering. With a calm voice, he held out his boarding pass. "Actually, I'm in seat 1A," he said, politely pointing to the ticket. Sarah sighed dramatically, her eyes rolling as if she couldn't believe she had to deal with him. She grabbed the ticket with unnecessary force, her lips pursed in a tight line as she examined it. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Her eyes flicked from the ticket to Jamal, as if she were looking for a mistake, some error in the system that would explain how he had ended up with a first-class seat. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his chest, but he remained steady. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, keeping his tone neutral, though he could feel the weight of her disdain pressing against him. For a moment, Sarah seemed to hesitate, as if searching for a way to challenge him further. Her gaze swept over him from head to toe, lingering on his sneakers before returning to his face. There was no mistaking the judgment in her eyes, the silent accusation that people like him didn't belong here, that first class wasn't for men with dark skin and casual clothes. Without another word, she shoved the ticket back into his hand, stepping aside with a forced smile. "Enjoy your flight," she said, though her tone made it clear that she would rather he hadn't been there at all. Jamal felt the eyes of other passengers on him as he walked down the aisle toward his seat. He could sense their quiet curiosity, their glances filled with assumptions and whispered judgments. He wasn't just another traveler to them, he was a story, a question mark. What was he doing here? How had he managed to sit among the elite? As Jamal sank into the plush leather of his first-class seat, he exhaled slowly. He had paid for this seat just like everyone else, but somehow he had to justify his presence. He glanced around at the other passengers, well-dressed businessmen and women, scrolling through emails on their tablets, sipping champagne without a care in the world, and here he was, sitting in the same space, but somehow made to feel like an intruder. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Jamal watched as Sarah moved through the rows, her smile bright and pleasant as she attended to the other first-class travelers. But when she reached Jamal's row, her expression hardened once again. She didn't ask if he wanted anything. She didn't even look at him. Jamal leaned back in his seat, trying to ignore the knot of frustration that was building in his chest. He had faced worse. He could handle this. But as the flight continued and Sarah continued to ignore him, the knot only tightened. When he politely asked for a glass of water, she turned to him with a thin smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe later," she said, her tone making it clear that later wasn't coming anytime soon. Jamal sat in silence, the sting of her words hanging in the air between them. It wasn't just about the water. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond a single interaction on a plane. It was about the subtle, persistent ways that people like Sarah made it known that people like Jamal didn't belong. He glanced around again, noticing the sidelong glances from a few other passengers. They had seen it, too. They had seen how Sarah treated him differently, how she withheld the basic courtesies she extended so easily to others. But no one said anything. No one ever did. Jamal clenched his fists under the table, the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't going to let this pass unnoticed. He wasn't going to let Sarah Mitchell get away with treating him as less than human just because of the color of his skin. For now, though, he would wait. Jamal stood at the entrance to the first-class cabin, the sharp tone of Sarah's voice still lingering in his ears. Her words, "Are you sure this is your seat?" echoed in his mind, each syllable heavy with condescension. For a moment he considered saying something, anything to address the blatant disrespect. But he had learned long ago that there were battles worth fighting, and others where composure was the best armor. With a quiet breath, Jamal chose not to react outwardly. He straightened his posture and nodded silently, holding out his boarding pass. He pointed to the number printed clearly 1A, a symbol of the hard work and discipline that had gotten him to this point. Sarah, the flight attendant, scanned the ticket with a disdainful glance before motioning him through, her expression barely hiding her disbelief. Jamal found his seat, sat down, and placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment. He settled into the plush leather chair, trying to shake off the weight of the encounter. He could feel eyes on him, the silent stares of other passengers who had witnessed the exchange, some out of curiosity, others with judgment. A few murmured to one another, their whispers faint but sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the cabin. He wasn't sure what was being said, but he knew the tone. He had heard it before on the streets, in business meetings, and now even 30,000 feet in the air. Sarah hadn't stopped. As she moved through the aisle, her actions toward Jamal were laced with subtle but undeniable contempt. She smiled warmly at the other first-class passengers, asking if they needed anything, offering to hang their jackets, and ensuring their glasses were always full. But when she passed Jamal, her demeanor shifted, her smile disappeared, her gaze hardened. Each time he asked for something, a glass of water, a snack, she responded curtly, pretending not to hear him, or, worse, rolling her eyes as if his presence was a personal inconvenience. "Excuse me," Jamal said calmly, raising his hand as she passed once again. "Can I please get some water?" Sarah paused, turning to face him. Her smile was tight, forced. "Maybe later," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I'm busy right now," and with that, she turned on her heel, dismissing him as though he were invisible. Jamal clenched his jaw but remained silent. He could feel the quiet tension building inside him, the weight of her disrespect pressing down harder with each passing moment. But he had dealt with this kind of treatment before, and he knew better than to let it rattle him. Still, it didn't make the sting of her behavior any easier to endure. He glanced around the cabin, noticing how some passengers avoided eye contact, while others seemed to share in Sarah's quiet disapproval. A knot formed in his chest, but he breathed deeply, refusing to let the moment get the better of him. His father had always told him that dignity and respect were things that could never be taken from you unless you gave them away. And Jamal had no intention of giving them away now, not for Sarah, and not for anyone else. Jamal shifted in his seat, trying to refocus on the work he had planned to review during the flight. The presentation for the meeting in New York was important, a critical step for his career. But Sarah's behavior was making it difficult to concentrate, her repeated snubs gnawing at him, stirring a frustration he had been trying to keep in check. As he opened his laptop, the passenger seated in 1 billion right next to him leaned over slightly. Jamal hadn't paid him much attention before, but now the man spoke in a low voice, his words filled with a mix of sympathy and quiet understanding. "Don't let her get to you," the man said, offering a small, supportive smile. "She's done this before, trust me, especially to people who look like you." Jamal blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the stranger's candidness. The man David Cooper, a white man in his late 40s with a kind, weathered face, gestured subtly towards Sarah, who was busy tending to other passengers, her back turned. Jamal glanced at her and then back at David, his frustration tempered by the unexpected gesture of solidarity. "You've seen this happen before?" Jamal asked quietly, his voice laced with curiosity and a hint of disbelief. He had assumed Sarah's behavior was personal, an isolated case of bias. But if David's words were true, then her actions were part of something much larger, a pattern of prejudice that went beyond this single encounter. David nodded, his expression softening with a touch of weariness. "Yeah, unfortunately, I've flown with her before, and let's just say, she has her favorites and her biases." He paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening too closely. "It's not right, what she's doing, and I've seen her pull the same kind of attitude with other black passengers before. It's disgusting." Jamal exhaled slowly, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. On the one hand, it was comforting to know that he wasn't imagining the slights, that someone else saw what was happening. But on the other hand, it angered him even more to realize that this wasn't an isolated incident, that Sarah's behavior was part of a deeper, more insidious problem. "Thanks," Jamal said, his voice quiet but sincere. He appreciated David's words more than he could express. It was rare to find someone willing to speak up, to acknowledge the racial bias that so often went unnoticed or unaddressed. In a world where many would turn a blind eye or stay silent, David's willingness to confront the issue, even in this small way, was a gesture of kindness that didn't go unnoticed. David leaned back in his seat, offering a reassuring nod. "I know it's frustrating, but don't let it ruin your flight. People like her, they thrive on making others feel small. But you don't have to give her that power." Jamal nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. He knew David was right. He couldn't let Sarah's narrow-mindedness get under his skin, couldn't allow her to dictate how he felt about himself or his place in the world. He had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles to let one person's prejudice diminish his sense of worth. As the flight continued, Sarah's attitude didn't change. She still served the other passengers with a smile, still skipped over Jamal as though he didn't exist. But now, armed with David's quiet support, Jamal found it easier to endure. He didn't need Sarah's approval, didn't need her validation. He knew who he was, knew his value, and that was enough. Still, the experience left a bitter taste in his mouth. The knowledge that, even in 2024, even with all the progress that had been made, there were still people like Sarah, people who judged others based on the color of their skin, who wielded their biases with impunity. But Jamal also knew that people like David existed too, people who were willing to stand up, even in small ways, against injustice. And for now, that was enough to keep him grounded, to remind him that dignity and respect were things no one could take from him, no matter what. The atmosphere on the plane was quiet and subdued, with the hum of the engines filling the space as passengers settled in for the long flight. Jamal Lewis, seated comfortably in first class, tried to relax despite the undercurrent of unease he felt. His focus shifted to the clouds outside the window, but the lingering discomfort gnawed at him. It had started the moment he boarded the plane. Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant, had barely acknowledged him. Her sharp, dismissive tone, the pointed look at his casual clothes, and the way she brushed him off when he handed over his first-class ticket had all been red flags. But Jamal, accustomed to navigating such subtle slights, had let it slide at first. Time passed, and Sarah made her way down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks with a bright smile to the other passengers. Each time she passed by his seat, Jamal felt the tension rise. He could sense the other passengers noticing it too, their glances growing longer, their whispers more frequent. Jamal raised his hand politely when Sarah approached, her tray filled with glasses of water. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" he asked, his voice calm, though inside he was growing increasingly frustrated. Sarah's reaction was immediate, and her smirk carried a deliberate sting. "Maybe later," she replied without even slowing her pace. Her tone was flippant, as though she were doing him a favor. "If I have time." Jamal blinked in disbelief. He watched as she moved on, effortlessly serving the passengers behind him. He clenched his fists under the table, the weight of her behavior pressing down harder with each passing minute. He wasn't the only one to notice. A couple across the aisle exchanged a look of concern, while another passenger leaned forward, as if about to intervene. The tension in the air became thick. Jamal could feel eyes on him, some curious, others judgmental. It was as if Sarah's dismissive treatment had sparked a quiet agreement among some of the passengers. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, and Jamal couldn't help but feel the sting of those unspoken judgments. Why him? Why now? It wasn't the first time he had experienced racial discrimination, but something about the subtlety of this one, how it spread quietly through the cabin like wildfire, was even more infuriating. It was an insult that refused to reveal itself too boldly, yet it was unmistakably there, weaving its way into every interaction. Jamal's patience, though steady, was running thin. He had learned long ago that his calm demeanor was his greatest strength, but even the strongest of resolves could only stretch so far. He could feel a storm of emotions building within him: frustration, anger, and exhaustion from a lifetime of moments just like this. As Sarah walked by him yet again, smiling at the passengers ahead, Jamal leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Excuse me," he said, louder this time. "I asked for water." She paused, looked back at him, and gave him a patronizing smile. "I'm sure you'll get it eventually," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Without another word, she turned away, leaving Jamal sitting there, simmering with the realization of what was happening. She wasn't just being rude, this was about something deeper, something uglier. He wasn't being ignored because of a busy flight schedule or forgetfulness. It was deliberate, and it was personal. The murmurs grew louder around him. He caught bits and pieces of conversation, speculative whispers, glances that tried to piece together the dynamic between him and the flight attendant. Some passengers had clearly picked up on what was happening. Others seemed confused or even indifferent. And then there were those who, perhaps, quietly agreed with Sarah's unspoken assumptions. Jamal felt the heat rise in his chest. He had spent years trying to distance himself from the privilege his father's name brought, trying to carve out a path for himself without relying on his family's status. Yet here he was, reduced to a stereotype by someone who knew nothing about him. Enough was enough. Jamal's calm, composed exterior cracked slightly as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His movement drew the attention of several passengers, but he ignored their curious stares as he made his way down the narrow aisle toward the front of the plane. The feeling of being watched followed him like a shadow. He could hear the whispers, could feel the silent questions in the air. Was he going to make a scene? Was he overreacting? He didn't care anymore. All he wanted was the respect any paying customer deserved. "Excuse me," Jamal said firmly to a passing flight attendant. "I'd like to speak to the head of customer service." The attendant nodded, her demeanor shifting immediately when she saw the seriousness on his face. "I'll get her for you, sir," she said, disappearing quickly to fetch the supervisor. A few minutes later, Nicole Henderson, the head of customer service, approached Jamal's seat with a warm but professional smile. Her presence was calming, a sharp contrast to the hostility Jamal had felt all flight long. Nicole, a tall woman with a composed air of authority, took a seat across from Jamal, giving him her full attention. "Mr. Lewis, I'm Nicole Henderson, head of customer service," she said. "I understand there's been a problem. Can you tell me what's going on?" Jamal nodded, the frustration evident in his tone, despite his efforts to remain calm. "I've asked several times for basic things, water, service, and each time, I've been ignored or dismissed by your flight attendant, Sarah. It's not just once or twice, it's been deliberate and consistent." Nicole's expression shifted from calm to concern as Jamal continued. "She's made comments, given me looks, and treated me differently from everyone else here," Jamal added, his voice controlled but edged with frustration. "I don't want to assume the worst, but it's hard not to feel like it's because of my race." Nicole's eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned in, her voice dropping as she spoke. "Mr. Lewis, I'm truly sorry for what you've experienced," she said softly. "No one should be treated that way, and I want you to know that I'll handle this immediately. I take these matters very seriously." Jamal appreciated her sincerity, but the tension of the moment still hung heavy. It's 2024, and this kind of thing still happens," he said, shaking his head. "I don't want special treatment. I just want to be treated like everyone else." Nicole nodded, understanding the weight of his words. As a black woman herself, she knew exactly what Jamal was talking about. She had seen it in her own life, in subtle and blatant ways, and knew the toll it could take on someone's spirit. "Mr. Lewis, I understand," Nicole said, her voice steady. "Please allow me a few moments to address this. I will make sure that this is handled properly." Before standing up, Nicole glanced over at Sarah, who was busy pretending not to notice what was happening. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and Jamal could see a flicker of understanding pass between them. Nicole had seen this before, maybe not with Sarah directly, but with others like her. As Nicole left to address the situation, Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart still raced with a mix of anger and exhaustion, but at least he felt heard. He watched as Nicole approached Sarah, the two women exchanging hushed words. Sarah's face paled slightly, her previous arrogance fading as Nicole spoke with a quiet authority. Jamal could see the tension draining from the other passengers as well, as though they too had been waiting for something to be done. A few passengers glanced at him with what seemed like sympathy, others with curiosity, but Jamal no longer cared. He had done what he needed to do. Back in his seat, Jamal leaned his head against the window, trying to regain his composure. He hadn't wanted things to escalate this way, but sometimes, standing up for yourself meant confronting uncomfortable truths. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but he also wasn't willing to accept disrespect in silence. The plane's quiet hum seemed a little less oppressive now. Even if Sarah's behavior hadn't been fully corrected yet, at least someone in authority was paying attention. For now, that was enough. And as the flight continued, Jamal reminded himself of one thing: dignity was not something anyone could take from him. As the flight carried on, Sarah Mitchell moved with an air of control through the aisles of first class, her face composed in its usual mask of indifference. She had ignored Jamal several times now, each slight a subtle but sharp sting that he absorbed in silence. The other passengers continued to murmur softly around him, many unaware of the tension Sarah had created with her dismissive attitude. Jamal had taken it in stride, but there was a fire behind his calm exterior, one that was steadily growing with each passive-aggressive action. Sarah hadn't bothered to hide her contempt when she interacted with him. In her eyes, he didn't belong in first class. His casual attire, the quiet confidence he exuded, something about him disturbed her perception of what a first-class passenger should look like. She hadn't seen him as an equal, but that was about to change. She was walking past him again, her eyes forward, chin up, when she overheard Nicole Henderson, the head of customer service, talking to him. Nicole's voice, low but firm, carried an apology that Sarah hadn't expected to hear. "Mr. Lewis, I assure you we will handle this matter with the utmost seriousness," Nicole said, her words respectful and careful. Lewis. The name landed like a shockwave in Sarah's mind. She froze mid-step, the blood draining from her face. Her eyes widened as realization struck her with the force of a sudden storm. Lewis, as in Gregory Lewis, the owner of Unity Airways, the very man whose name carried weight in every corner of the airline industry. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, panic washing over her like ice-cold water. Her hands trembled, the tray she was carrying almost slipping from her grip. This is his son, she thought, her heart racing. She glanced back at Jamal, the man she had been treating like an outsider, the man she had looked down upon without a second thought. Suddenly, the smug superiority she had felt vanished. The room seemed to tilt as the consequences of her actions became all too real. The weight of her prejudice settled heavily on her shoulders, and she stammered her way toward Jamal, her composure shattered. I didn't realize, Mr. Lewis," she mumbled, her voice shaking. "It was a misunderstanding, I thought." She trailed off, knowing deep down that there was no real excuse for her behavior. Her mind scrambled for a justification, but nothing sounded remotely reasonable. Every word felt hollow, and she knew Jamal could see right through her. The power dynamics had shifted entirely in a matter of moments. Her fate now rested not in her ability to hide behind her uniform, but in the hands of the man she had mistreated so unfairly. Jamal's eyes met hers, calm but unrelenting. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was louder than any words Sarah could have mustered. His expression held an undeniable truth: "You misjudged me because of the color of my skin." The tension between Sarah and Jamal lingered thickly in the air, but before either could speak further, Jamal's phone buzzed. He glanced down, expecting a message from his business partner, but his breath caught when he saw the name on the screen: Dad. His thumb slid across the phone, and there it was, a simple, yet commanding message from Gregory Lewis: "I heard what's happening. I'm handling it." Jamal's heart raced. He hadn't said anything to his father. How could Gregory know about this incident? His father was a man with a wide-reaching network, but this was something that had only happened minutes ago. Jamal felt a mixture of surprise and discomfort. His father's shadow loomed large over many aspects of his life, but this felt personal. He glanced back at Sarah, whose face had now become a pale mask of regret. The power she once held over him had crumbled, and Jamal couldn't help but wonder what exactly his father had done or was about to do. His mind reeled. How had his father found out? Jamal knew Gregory wasn't the type to sit idly by when someone disrespected his family, but the speed at which he had intervened was almost unnerving. Jamal's throat tightened, conflicted between pride and a sense of losing his own agency. He hadn't wanted his father to interfere. He had wanted to handle this himself, on his own terms. But now, it seemed, the situation had already taken a turn beyond his control. Gregory Lewis was not just a father, he was a titan of industry, and when he stepped in, things happened fast and with finality. Jamal's fingers hovered over the screen, He thought about calling his father to tell him to stop, that he didn't want the situation blown out of proportion. But before he could act, a low hum buzzed through the airplane's speakers, drawing his attention. The pilot's voice echoed through the cabin, calm but with an edge that suggested something significant was happening behind the scenes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for any inconvenience. There's been a customer service issue on board, and we're currently addressing it. Thank you for your patience. The tone of the flight shifted in an instant. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and passengers exchanged puzzled glances. The air around Jamal felt heavier, charged with the curiosity of those around him. Everyone knew something was going on now. Sarah's face tightened with panic, and she glanced nervously at Jamal. The weight of the pilot's words pressed on her like a vice. Her hands fidgeted at her sides as if unsure of what to do next. She had gone from confidently wielding her authority as a flight attendant to standing on the precipice of humiliation and professional disaster. The stares of passengers burned into her skin, and it became clear that she could no longer hide the truth of her actions behind a facade of professionalism. Jamal sat back, letting the captain's words settle over him like a calming wave. The whole plane had been alerted to the issue now, and there was no turning back for Sarah. It was out of his hands, and for the first time during this ordeal, he felt a small sense of vindication. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or cause a scene. He had simply stood firm, maintained his dignity, and now, the consequences of Sarah's behavior were unraveling on their own. Passengers started to murmur, stealing glances at Jamal, wondering if he was the reason behind the pilot's announcement. They hadn't noticed the subtle racial tensions before, but now, with the captain's voice cutting through the atmosphere, they sensed that something more profound was at play. Sarah shifted uncomfortably under the pressure of the many eyes on her. Her once haughty demeanor had evaporated, replaced with a desperate need to correct the situation. She moved toward Jamal, her voice trembling as she stammered out a rushed apology. "Mr. Lewis, I'm truly sorry. I didn't realize. I never meant for this to happen." Jamal looked at her with calm resolve, the silence between them speaking volumes. Her apology, though now filled with remorse, came too late. The damage had been done, not only to her reputation but to her understanding of the world. She had misjudged him, not because of anything he had done, but because of the assumptions she had made about who he was. In that moment, Jamal didn't need to respond. The lesson was clear, and Sarah knew it. She would walk away from this flight, not just with the knowledge that she had wronged someone, but with the weight of knowing she had underestimated the very people she had been taught to serve. The announcement had been made, and there was no undoing what had been revealed. Now it was Sarah who had to face the consequences. As the plane rolled to a stop, Jamal glanced out of the small, oval window, his thoughts still spinning from the events of the flight. He noticed two uniformed staff members from Unity Airways waiting at the gate, unmistakably heading toward the plane. He tightened his grip on the armrest, preparing himself for whatever was about to unfold. When the plane's doors finally opened, the first-class passengers began gathering their belongings. Jamal stayed seated, watching as the two Unity Airways representatives approached with a sense of purpose. Their sharp, professional demeanor contrasted with the relaxed air of the passengers disembarking around them. "Mr. Lewis," one of them asked, her voice calm but respectful. Jamal nodded, his face a mask of calm, despite the simmering frustration beneath the surface. Without needing to say a word, he rose to his feet, and the two staff members led him off the plane. As he moved down the jet bridge, he could feel the curious stares of fellow passengers lingering on him, no doubt wondering what this man had done to garner such attention. Some faces were filled with judgment, others with vague sympathy. But Jamal walked with quiet dignity, not acknowledging the looks. The representatives led him past the bustling crowds and through a restricted hallway. They finally arrived at an elegant, glass-enclosed lounge tucked away from the public eye. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather, and the muted hum of conversation filled the space. It was an oasis of calm amidst the chaos of the airport. "Please take a seat, Mr. Lewis," one of the representatives said, motioning to a sleek black chair. Jamal nodded, appreciating the professionalism but still unsettled by the unease he felt coursing through him. As he sat down, the door to the private lounge opened. Nicole Henderson, the head of customer service, entered with a composed, yet concerned expression. Behind her was John Reynolds, the CEO of Unity Airways, his silver hair immaculate, his presence commanding. And finally, Gregory Lewis, Jamal's father, stepped into the room, his broad shoulders and steady gaze unmistakable. He had that rare ability to make any room bend to his will, and now, with his tailored suit and measured steps, he radiated quiet authority. Jamal Gregory said softly, his voice a mixture of concern and reassurance. He gave his son a subtle nod as if to convey that everything would be handled from this moment forward. Jamal's eyes moved from his father to Nicole and then to John Reynolds, whose expression was a mix of discomfort and deep regret. There was a moment of silence, a collective exhale of anticipation, as the CEO took a seat across from Jamal. Mr. Lewis, John Reynolds began, his voice careful but weighted with sincerity. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received on this flight. This is not the standard we uphold at Unity Airways, and frankly, I am ashamed of the behavior of one of our employees. Jamal listened, his face impassive, though his mind was churning. He could hear the words, but they felt rehearsed, like they had been uttered before in other situations, to other people, for other reasons. Reynolds continued, glancing at Nicole before proceeding. We've already taken immediate action. Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant responsible for this incident, has been removed from duty. She will face disciplinary action, and this situation will be thoroughly investigated. This kind of behavior, especially in 2024, is unacceptable. Jamal's eyes flickered with the slightest hint of emotion, but he kept his composure. He nodded once, acknowledging the apology but feeling the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. He had heard apologies before. Words were easy. Change, he knew, was harder. Gregory Lewis, sitting quietly beside his son, finally spoke, his tone measured but firm. Jamal doesn't ask for special treatment, John. What he expects, like any other passenger, is respect. Nothing more, nothing less. People like Sarah may not realize the damage they cause, but it's real. And Unity Airways, like every business, must reflect the values it claims to stand for. Jamal felt his father's words strike a chord deep within him. It was true. He didn't want to be treated differently because of who his father was. He simply wanted to be treated like everyone else. Nicole, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now stepped forward. We are deeply sorry, Mr. Lewis. I know words can only go so far, but I assure you that changes will be made. This incident won't be brushed aside. Jamal nodded, appreciating her sincerity, but still unsure of what real change would come from this. After the meeting concluded, Jamal stepped out of the lounge, his mind swirling with the events that had just transpired. The apologies, the promises of change, the corporate pleasantries, he had heard it all before. But as he made his way toward the exit, with the distant hum of the airport growing louder, he realized something deeper was gnawing at him. His father, walking beside him, glanced at Jamal and quietly asked, "Are you okay, son?" Jamal paused, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. He had always known that being a black man in America, no matter the success or wealth he achieved, meant navigating a world where respect wasn't always freely given. Even in places where it should be automatic, like a first-class seat he had paid for, it was still something he had to fight for. I didn't want special treatment, Dad, Jamal said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. I just wanted to be treated with basic respect, like any other person. Gregory nodded, his expression serious. I know, Jamal. But people like Sarah need to be reminded of the reality of the world they live in. Sometimes they think they're above the lessons that life needs to teach them. Sometimes they need a wake-up call. Jamal shook his head slightly. It's not just her, Dad, it's the whole system. Even now, in 2024, people like her still think they can get away with treating people like me, as if we don't belong. And it's not just about this flight, it's everywhere, no matter how much we succeed, no matter what we achieve. There's always someone who thinks they can take that respect away. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. You're right. But that's why we stand up, not just for ourselves, but for the people who come after us, for the people who don't have the same platform you and I have. Jamal sighed deeply, thinking about the countless others who had faced similar situations, who had experienced the sting of racism, but didn't have the privilege of calling on a CEO or having a powerful father to step in. They were the ones who bore the brunt of these daily humiliations, often in silence. As they approached the car waiting for them, Jamal stopped for a moment, looking out at the busy airport, the crowds of people rushing to and fro. It hit him that racial discrimination wasn't some relic of the past. It was still here, lingering beneath the surface, in places you wouldn't expect, in first-class cabins, in boardrooms, in everyday interactions. But standing up for dignity and respect, no matter who you were, was still the most important thing. Jamal knew that the fight wasn't over, that his journey wasn't just about business success or personal accomplishments. It was about something much bigger. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, received the respect they deserved. As they got into the car and pulled away from the airport, Jamal glanced at his father, who was watching him carefully. There was a shared understanding between them. This fight was ongoing, but they would face it together. And with that thought, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that dignity and respect weren't things anyone could give or take away. They were his, and he would always stand up for them, no matter the cost.